It's a warm welcome to Africa 360, the current affairs show that goes beneath the surface to bring you all the information about your continent that you won't get anywhere else. If it's about Africa, we're talking about it on our program. I'm Chris Maroleng, and this is Africa 360. In this edition, 3 weeks of fierce fighting and what appears to be resounding success. French troops have won back the cities of northern Mali. But even as the French and Malian forces fought, a major decision is taken at the recent African Union summit. This week on Africa 360, we continue our focus on Mali and look at the continent's commitment to resolving the crisis in that country. All this and more coming up right here on Africa 360. Well, the African Union and West Africa's regional bloc, ECOWAS, have been heavily criticized for what has been described as a lackluster response to the crisis in Mali. Well, now, African leaders have made several commitments to addressing the situation in that country following the recent 20th African Union summit in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Some of these commitments include financial contributions to the African-led International Support Mission to Mali, also known as AFISMA. It's the first time the African Union has made such a contribution towards peace-building operations, particularly at such a high monetary value. Let's take a look at the pledges or contributions made by some African and international partners at the just-ended summit. Well, as you can see from our slide here, a total value of $453 million were contributed at the summit. And of course, of that $150 million raised, Japan came to the party with $120 million. Now, the interesting thing about these contributions is that the African Union, that is, African countries, contributed to the value of $50 million. Of that $50 million, South Africa contributed $10 million. As you can see, small countries like Sierra Leone even came to the party contributing $1 million. It was quite an achievement. As you can see there, that's an interesting stark comparison to China, global superpower, that only contributed $1 million to this peace and security effort. Well, a slow response by the regional bloc ECOWAS to deploy troops in Mali has been criticized by some observers. Nevertheless, at least 1,400 ECOWAS troops are on the ground as we speak. The slow deployment of African troops, contributors that is, has been in stark contrast with the rapid deployment of French troops, which have been widely commended by African leaders, particularly at this recent AU summit. Leaders at the summit also reiterated the need for African troop contributors to scale up their numbers in Mali. It's expected that at full force levels, troops will number between 5,000 and 6,000, up from the initially planned 3,300 troops. Let's take a look at the ECOWAS troop contribution in Mali so far. Well, as you can see from the pictures playing there, Chad in particular has come to the party contributing at least 2,000 troops. Benin also contributed about 650 troops. Nigeria, which is seen as a West African superpower and a hub, as you can see from the visuals playing in our graphic there, I expected to contribute 1,200 troops, that is at full force deployments. Burkina Faso, Niger, Senegal, Togo are expected also to provide 500 troops to this mission each. Guinea and Ghana are also some of the troop contributors. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the Malian troops themselves, that is, troops from Mali themselves, suffered severe casualties close to a town known as Gao, where after going over a landmine, it's reported that 4 of their troops were killed in that intervention. Well, African leaders have welcomed France's quick intervention in Mali and for the first time have acknowledged their own slow response. eNCA senior reporter Dumalo Motladi was at the Addis summit and compiled this report.
In this regard,
the African Union's summit may have ended with an emphatic $50 million commitment to the Mali war effort. African leaders expressed great pride that the AU's Peace and Security Commission would also settle 15% of the overall Mali peacekeeping bill. But that didn't spare African heads of state from stinging criticism over their woeful handling of the Mali crisis. From one of their own, outgoing AU chairman and Benin President Boni Yayi. During the opening remarks of the two-day summit, the outgoing AU chairperson expressed his long-standing gratitude to France for its quick intervention. Boni Yayi also described Africa's response to the Mali crisis as unacceptable.
How can we understand the danger that threaten the very basis, that is Africa, which has its own means, cannot organize its own defense and continues to wait?
Boni Yayi's unprecedented attack was downplayed by those attending the summit. Delegates dismissed his comments as a repeat of views already being discussed and dealt with by the AU. AU Commission Chair Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma believes Africa needs a standby force of its own to swiftly react and resolve future conflicts and avoid the humiliation of Africans playing second fiddle to international interventions in continental matters. Boni Yayi's criticism seemed to set the tone for the rest of the summit, as more drama unfolded over another conflict which was high on the African Union agenda. On the final day, there had been hopes for a breakthrough in the ever-turbulent Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon had even scheduled a high-profile signing ceremony to unveil a new peace initiative. But African leaders snubbed the event, forcing a last-minute cancellation. Ban Ki-moon tried his best to downplay the saga, putting it down to a misunderstanding between the UN and regional leaders. Despite the controversy and conflict, however, delegates and analysts say the robust and frank self-critique could signal a shift for the African Union summits. These are traditionally seen as mere talk shops, with very little coming out of the proceedings. But there are signs that the AU may be moving towards more decisive actions, something the organization needs to do to avoid becoming irrelevant.
Thank you, Dumali, for that report. Join us after the break as I'll be in conversation with Dr. Adekeye Adebajo from the Center for Conflict Resolution, where we unpack the situation in Mali only on Africa 360.
This is an international responsibility. It's not only an African responsibility. And if Africans are keeping peace elsewhere in the world, we also deserve to have others assist Africa.
Welcome back. You're watching Africa 360, and today we continue our focus on the situation in Mali following the just ended 20th African Union Summit, which specifically made major decisions aimed at resolving the crisis in that country. Well, over $453 million, that's in the way of donations, were raised at that summit to help stabilize the situation in that country. I'm now joined by Dr. Adekeye Adebajo from the center, and in fact, he's the executive director from the Center for Conflict Resolution to help me take our conversation further. Ade, if I may call you that, warm welcome to Africa 360. Let's get right into our conversation then. You heard my introduction. The just ended AU summit made some major deliberations, what I've described as a lackluster response by the African Union in particular seems to have taken a slightly different perspective, at least by way of financial contributions.
Well, Chris, thanks. I think it's important to acknowledge some of the difficulties that African countries have with peacekeeping, and also to acknowledge that peacekeeping itself is an international commitment and a duty of the whole international community rather than just Africa. So you have Nigeria and Ethiopia, for example, as the 5th and 4th largest contributors to UN peacekeeping. And there are about 7 African countries that are also in the top 20 countries, including your own South Africa, in terms of contributing to United Nations peacekeeping. So I think one should acknowledge that some of these countries, even though they may not have financial resources, are contributing in terms of human resources. $50 million was contributed by the African Union. You could say that it's a bit low, but remember that the African Union has a budget of only about $260 million, and South Africa itself contributed $10 million. So if you look at it in terms of GDP size and wealth size, it's actually not a bad contribution, and it's certainly a change from the past that African countries themselves are pledging.
A number of countries have made commitments, particularly through the framework of the West African Regional Organization, ECOWAS, to contribute troops. But Ade, what I note is that we haven't seen the full commitment being seen in the way of boots, actual boots on the ground. Take us through that. Why don't you?
Well, the troops are arriving, but they're arriving slowly. So, for example, Chad has pledged 2,000 troops. Nigeria has pledged just under the same amount of troops, and there are troops from Niger, from Burkina Faso, that would be a bit smaller, around 700 troops. They're arriving slowly, and part of the problem is that they don't really have the transport capacity to be able to deploy very rapidly. And you notice that even the French have been helped by both the Americans and the British in terms of their deployment. Even their own capacity for deploying is a bit slow. And the fact is that they had troops on the ground in Senegal and elsewhere that they could deploy more rapidly. But this is a general problem with United Nations peacekeeping even, where you have to mobilize troops from the scratch, and it can take them up to 6 months to deploy. We saw it in the UN's mission in Darfur and elsewhere.
It does sound like you are taking the role of apologist here for African countries who have been talking about establishing such capacity through at least an African standby force, which has been on the table for almost decades now, and nothing has come out of this. What's your view on that, Ade?
Well, I think, Chris, I'm very tough on African governments in terms of their governance and other failings. But I think we must also acknowledge some of the sacrifices that have been made in the recent past. Nigeria led a West African peacekeeping force into Liberia and Sierra Leone in the 1990s, and they actually suffered 1,500 fatalities in the process in nearly a decade of peacekeeping. You currently now have Ugandan, Burundian, and Kenyan troops making peace in Somalia, in a country that's been anarchic and acephalous for 2 decades. Nobody wanted to go into Somalia after the US and others pulled out in the early 1990s. So even though the African Standby Brigade is not yet fully ready and operational, I think it's important to acknowledge that at least the capacity compared to the 1990s has improved. And what you must never move away from is the fact that this is an international responsibility. It's not only an African responsibility. And if Africans are keeping peace elsewhere in the world, we also deserve to have others assist Africa.
I'm glad you've raised the point that this is an international peacekeeping venture. In actual fact, let's take a look at a bite. That is a statement that was made by Ban Ki-moon, who is the Secretary General of the United Nations, at the just ended AU summit, and see what he had to say.
Those terrorist groups with whom dialogue is not possible, the military operation is inevitable. And that is why whole African Union and Western powers, they are supporting. The United Nations is now actively considering, through my recommendation to the Security Council, how United Nations can help those African countries in terms of logistical support.
Well, Ade, that was the United Nations Secretary General making the point again that the United Nations and the international community remains committed to this. However, what is striking when you look at other regions, Ade, is that when they want to deal with peace and security issues in their area, they don't need really to go to the United Nations to seek some kind of resolution like 2053, which authorized this mission in Mali. Africa really needs to develop its own capacity. And I'll emphasize this again, Ade, that we've got to get going, get cracking with developing this kind of capacity. We can't look to the United Nations.
I couldn't agree with you more, Chris. But I would say that I would nuance the argument a little bit. I think we have every right to look to the United Nations, and I would disagree with the fact that other regions don't go to the United Nations. You know, when Bosnia erupted into conflict between 1992 and 1995, the French and British deployed troops under a United Nations mission, which meant that the whole of the international community, including the Africans, were paying for that mission. When East Timor descended into conflict and got its self-determination referendum from Indonesia in 1999, the United Nations also deployed troops. It's also deployed troops in El Salvador, in Latin America. So I think Africa, just as every other region in the world, has a right to call on the United Nations to help support its lack of capacity at the moment.
Fantastic insights there. We'll in fact be talking exactly about an exit strategy for the international component that is currently in Mali. So do stay with us and join us after the break as we continue our discussion on Africa's role in solving the situation in Mali. Only on Africa 360. Back to Africa 360. Today we continue our focus on the situation in Mali, particularly the continent's commitment to resolving the crisis, especially when we put it within the context of the criticism that has been leveled against the African Union and whether it should really be leading the military intervention in that country, at least through the principle of subsidiarity, where the West African Regional Organization, ECOWAS, should be seen to be taking the lead. Well, joining me in our discussion is Dr. Adekeye Adebajo, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Conflict Resolution, and he's coming to us from our studios in Cape Town. Ade, thank you for joining us once again in this segment. Look, the regional organization ECOWAS, as you pointed out, suffers several constraints, that difficulties in terms of airlift, difficulties in terms of projecting and deploying troops and forces into that area. Don't you think other countries on the African continent should up their contribution?
I think so. I think if other countries from Africa are able to contribute outside of the West African region, it would be a good thing, because it's in the interest not only of the West Africans but the North Africans who are directly affected by the terrorist threat that's in northern Mali and others in the rest of the continent. But I still insist, Chris, that we must not create an apartheid system of peacekeeping where mainly Africans and Asians send soldiers to Africa and other countries don't. In this particular case, since it's a terrorism issue that directly affects Europe, and, you know, Mali is not that far away from Europe, I think it's also important that other Western countries that have an interest in this particular situation, and not just France, which is not a disinterested intervener, actually contribute troops as well. It's not good just to have African troops contributing to international situations.
one of the other accusations, and now we focus on France's direct intervention in Mali, is that in actual fact, France is looking out for its own investments in Mali and generally in the region, Francophonie, Africa. What's your view about this? Is this out of some kind of mercantilistic foreign policy approach, colonialism again, France protecting its interests in Mali? What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think it's definitely a case of France protecting its interests in Mali, and you know, on the face of it, there's nothing wrong with that, because Nigeria and other countries also are trying to protect their interests in Mali. But I think the unique case of France is the fact that France has always had a neo-colonial and possessive approach towards Africa. It intervened over 40 times since independence to either support autocrats or get rid of autocrats in places like the Central African Republic with Emperor Bokassa, and more recently in Chad and Central African Republic, we've seen French interventions. I think in this particular case, there is a kind of coming together of interests, because I think the international community and countries in the region do have an interest in not having a terrorist base in northern Mali. But I would much rather that even if French troops were involved, it be done under a UN process, and France is one of the veto-wielding 5 permanent members of the Security Council, so it should be strengthening UN peacekeeping, not acting outside of it.
Well, you talk here about the presence, this almost neo-colonial approach by France. But let's talk about whether you anticipate that France has developed some kind of exit strategy, particularly in Mali, and how long it will take for French forces to hand over to AFISMA, which is the regional, that is the African regional force.
You know, Chris, I've always been very skeptical about the idea of an exit strategy, because I don't believe that if you're going to be committed to rebuilding a country, you should set yourself a time limit of an exit strategy. It seems a bit superficial to me, because it takes years both to keep peace and then to try to restore government authority so that the government of Mali actually has an army that is loyal to civilians. It's able to extend its authority throughout the whole country, and it's able to provide social services to its populations. And I think in that sense, it's very hard to actually say that there's going to be a time limit of how long the deployment might be. But on your specific question of when France should hand over to a more international African-led mission, I would hope that this can be done within, say, a 6-month period. Even if you still have some French troops there supporting the African missions, it's very important that this be multilateralized and not be seen as a unilateral French intervention.
Well, one of the consequences of the successes of France's intervention in Mali is that we've seen the insurgent groups beginning to move, and indeed move beyond the borders of Mali. One of the allegations that we're hearing is that some of these insurgent groups are moving into Libya. What's your view on that? Is there any veracity to these claims?
I think it may well be true, but it also happened the other way around. Because if you remember, there was a NATO-led intervention by France and Britain in Libya to topple the Muammar Gaddafi regime in 2011, basically through mostly air power and supporting rebels. And I think the blowback from that is now what we're seeing in northern Mali, because a lot of the rebels that were fighting with Gaddafi in Libya and a lot of the arms that were stolen from Libya have ended up in northern Mali. So there is an arc of instability that stretches not just to Libya, but also to Algeria, because a lot of the terrorist attacks and groups in Algeria were also driven out of there, and found a haven in northern Mali. So it's all interconnected in terms of these regional conflicts.
Well, that was Dr. Adekeye Adebajo from the Center for Conflict Resolution, coming to us from our studios in Cape Town. So you have our thanks for sharing those key insights with us about the state of the crisis in Mali and what the international response, indeed the African response to the challenges that have emerged have been. That brings us to the end of this edition of Africa 360. If you'd like to leave a comment or join the debate on Africa, you can find us on Facebook. You can also follow us on Twitter or drop us an email on africa360@enca.com. And remember, you're more than welcome to give us suggestions on topics you'd like us to cover on upcoming editions of your program, Africa 360. So, until next time, we look forward to bringing you Africa like you've never seen it before. Do take care.